Okay, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm Nancy Love, I coordinate the Humanities Council, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Bray, our speaker tonight. But before I do that, I want to thank the Center for Judaic, Holocaust, and Peace Studies for collaborating with the Humanities Council and all the members of the Humanities Council and also the Center who have put work into this event. And I also want to thank the Scholars Bookshop for being here with copies of Mark Bray's book. If you are interested in purchasing a copy after the talk, Dr. Bray has graciously offered to sign them for you, so we hope folks will do that. And then I also want to mention the Humanities Council's next and final event in our thematic program series this year. Our topic has been Sustaining Democracy, Existence, Persistence, and Resistance. And the final event is on April 19th from 7 to 9:30 in the Parkway Ballroom. And it'll be a screening of the film Charlie vs. Goliath, accompanied by the filmmaker, Reed Lindsay, and the protagonist, Charlie Hardy, who is a former Wyoming Senate candidate who is dedicated to returning American democracy to its citizens by getting money out of politics. So we hope to see some of you there as well. Tonight, we have with us Dr. Mark Bray, who's an historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe at Dartmouth College. And he is the author of the national bestseller, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, the Anarchist Inquisition, Terrorism and Human Rights in Spain and France, forthcoming, and the co-editor of Anarchist Education and the Modern School of Francisco Ferrer Reader. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Boston Review, Foreign Policy, and numerous edited volumes. And Dr. Bray will speak to us tonight on the topic Antifa, the History and Theory of Anti-Fascist Resistance. He will also take questions. I hope you will have a lot of them. And as I said, sign books after his talk. So welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, if you can't, give me a heads up and we'll improvise or get a microphone. This is a really great turnout. Not always the case, so really nice. Thank you to the Humanities Center. Thank you to the Center for Holocaust, Judaic, and Peace Studies. That's my best remembrance of the name of the center. So the key terms are in there. Thank you to all for making this happen. What I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about this book. It's going to be a history-focused presentation, but afterwards we can discuss in the Q&A all of the hot-button current events topics around speech, around violence and nonviolence. Anywhere you want to go with that is fine. That's no problem. So to start out with, the context of this book was not a long-term historical study. Historians usually measure the length of their projects in years. This was written in a matter of months to respond to the immediate context of Trump's electoral victory and the rise of the alt-right. And so in that way, it was very intentionally an effort to bring to bear historical research, the history of anti-fascist resistance, so that organizers could have a broader historical trajectory to situate their struggles within and a wider geographic focus. Because the book is about the history of anti-fascism in North America and Europe, based on interviews with more than 60 current and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries. So in that way, it hopes to paint that broader picture, which surprisingly has not really been painted in English. The historical work on post-war anti-fascism in English is minimal, and most of it's about Britain. So this is, to use an academic jargony phrase, I hope you'll excuse me, the first transnational history of post-war anti-fascism in English. There's been very little written about it, in part because I think some historians have been a little bit dismissive of it, but also because a lot of anti-fascists are reluctant to share their experiences with journalists or with scholars. They're concerned about being identified by law enforcement because some of what they do is illegal. They're concerned about being identified by the far right. So I managed to some extent to bridge that based on tapping into my political connections. I'm a longtime activist myself. I've been involved in a number of social movements. And so that level of trust and confidence allowed me to interview people who in many cases had never done an interview about their organizing. And so in that sense, the modern parts of this history were written through the perspectives of these organizers and through their various writings and articles about them. Now, Antifa, what we hear about in the news today, is nothing new, and it, in a certain sense, is simple. It's short for anti-fascism in a number of languages. But the term really, if we want to kind of dig into it a little more, refers to one specific tradition within the history of anti-fascism, which in English and Italian is often referred to as militant anti-fascism. In German is sometimes referred to as autonomous anti-fascism, and in French as radical anti-fascism. And it really exists at the intersection of two related considerations, right? The first is that it is a pan-radical left politics of social revolutionary self-defense against the far right. It incorporates all sorts of leftists and communists and anarchists who, at least for the time being, attempt to put aside their differences to resist the far right. And a lot of that was informed by the failure, for the most part, of the left to do that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The other consideration is that it is a form of resistance that focuses on direct action. Direct action meaning unmediated problem solving, trying to stop the problem without turning to the police or the state, because militant anti-fascists don't trust the state or the police to consistently stand up to fascism and defend them and others from the far right. So those are the two considerations. There are other anti-fascist traditions in Europe, for example, that argue for stopping the far right through making them illegal. Making it illegal to organize a Nazi party, a fascist party, passing laws against hate speech. This is a bit of a different tradition. Now, the book focuses on Europe and North America, not because that's the only part of the world where anti-fascism exists or has existed, but because I had to write this book in a relatively short period of time and had to constrain my focus to the areas I knew about and had contacts in. But anti-fascism has a global history. Concepts or paradigms of anti-fascism have informed, for example, Chinese resistance to Japanese imperialism, have informed Latin American resistance to dictatorships in the 1970s, decolonial resistance, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to realize that I'm talking about one small piece of the puzzle. There are Antifa groups in Brazil and Australia and Japan and so forth. But I think that really it's important to take even a bigger step back when we think of the politics of anti-fascism and recognize that really it's only one part of the puzzle. What do I mean by that? Well, for those of you who made it to the conversation that I had with some folks earlier today, we got into depth about what fascism is or is not and how that can inform what anti-fascism is. I'm not going to bore you all with a historiographical discussion, but if you have questions, we can get into that later. I'm bringing it up only because I was influenced by what Aimé Césaire, Du Bois, and others said about Nazism, which was, we can think of it to some extent as European imperialism, genocide, and white supremacy brought home to the European continent. So, scholars have debated that. If you take that as a point of departure and think of fascism as one facet of a global history of white supremacy and imperialism, then I think so too you can think of anti-fascism properly understood as one facet of a global history of resistance that can go back to 1492, that can go back to the first slave ships and so forth. And so in that way, I think it's important not to let the paradigm of anti-fascism subsume other forms of resistance. Important to lay out the beginning. That having been said, we're ready to get into the history. Okay, so where to start with fascism? Some historians have argued that to some extent you can think of the KKK as kind of the first proto-fascist formation, and if you do, then certainly you could think of resistance to the Klan as an early kind of proto-anti-fascism. Some have argued for seeing the anti-Semitic leagues that popped up during the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s as early examples of proto-fascism, and if you do, then I think you can think of the Revolutionary Coalition that formed in Paris as an early militant anti-fascist formation. They would show up to protect people going into the courthouse to testify on behalf of the wrongly accused Jewish Captain Dreyfus. They would tear down anti-Semitic propaganda and so forth. But if you want to start it with a sort of official fascism, the first movement to use the term in that way, even though the term predated Mussolini, but that's another story, we have Mussolini and his black shirts, who started terrorizing the Italian left in the immediate aftermath of World War I, who sought and received support from much of the Italian ruling class and used arguments about ultranationalism and a return to an imagined idyllic past to terrorize the left. There were all sorts of forms that resistance to fascism took, but for the purposes of our conversation, the most interesting was the Arditi del Popolo, or the People's Daring Ones, which was an armed anti-fascist militia that numbered approximately, if I remember correctly, about 20,000 members, had hundreds of chapters or groups around Italy, and picked up rifles to defend towns and villages against Mussolini's black shirts. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful for a variety of reasons. One was they really got going once it was sort of too late. Initially, Mussolini started out with 100 men. His initial fascist nucleus was no more than 100, but within 2 years, fascism had grown to have 250,000 adherents, and this was too little too late. But another reason why it didn't work out, which is equally important to bear in mind, is that the initial left unity that undergirded the Arditi fell apart. The Italian Socialist Party withdrew their support. The newly formed Italian Communist Party did the same, so at the end of its existence, the only institutional support from the left it received was from the Italian anarchist movement. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful. Had they been successful, maybe we wouldn't be having this presentation tonight. Let's go over to Germany a little bit. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking a fair amount about symbols. I think political symbols are interesting. Here we have the origin of the anti-fascist fist salute, which originated with the Red Front Fighters League, which was a communist paramilitary formation in the 1920s. Originally, the fist was a communist salute. Later, it became an anti-fascist salute. And it actually inspired Hitler to adopt the Italian fascist salute in response to this communist fist. It wasn't the other way around. Now, at this point, the Red Front Fighters League was really a revolutionary formation. They sought to overthrow the Weimar Republic. They weren't focused on the Nazis, which in the mid-20s was a very small political party. But later on, they would have to deal with them quite a bit more. Another popular anti-fascist symbol is the three arrows. Has anyone seen that symbol before? A smattering? Okay. The origin of this symbol can be found in the image from the top left, which is the lions crossing out the swastika. The origins of it are interesting. There was a Russian emigre named Chakotin who was affiliated with the German Socialist Party and was trying to think of a new way to rebrand the Socialist Party as their poll numbers were declining. They were losing votes to the communists and to the Nazis in the early 30s. So the socialists created this iron front against fascism to be more militant, but also to sort of rebrand themselves as their politics were getting a bit stale. The symbol that they came up with came when Chakotin was walking around the streets of Berlin and saw a line crossing out a swastika. He imagined the line as a downward-facing arrow, and then he imagined this single arrow as three arrows, and so the three arrows of anti-fascism were born. You can see them in the top right with the flags, the socialists in the bottom left carrying them. In the immediate post-war years, this was really mostly a socialist symbol, but subsequently became a broader anti-fascist symbol. Really, again, the Iron Front was not so much of a paramilitary organization, although there were militias that were part of it. It was more of an electoral vehicle, and when Hitler took power, it had really little to offer in the way of resistance. But the Iron Front influenced the German Communist Party to create anti-fascist action in the early 30s. It was one of the first organizations to have that kind of name, which has now become ubiquitous in modern anti-fascism, but in France in the 1920s, there was a Comité d'Action Antifasciste, which had a similar name earlier. Nevertheless, this is more influential. And does the pointer work on this? Let's see. All right, I'm going to use my finger. Here, you can see the original flags of the logo, which were both red. One for communism, one for socialism. Sometimes that's been read retrospectively as kind of this pan-radical left gesture. Socialists and communists standing together against fascism. But really, it was more of an effort by the communists to win over socialist voters, because at this time, the official line of the Communist International was that socialists were social fascists, no better than fascists themselves, equivalently the same. And so in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany, socialists and fascists were often at each other's throats more than they were opposed to the Nazis. And even the name of the organization, Anti-Fascist Action, did not refer to the Nazis exclusively, but referred to broader fascistic tendencies that the German Communist Party felt were evident in the German right. When Hitler came to power, most of the leadership of the German left thought that he would be just another weak chancellor and had no idea of the kind of dictator he would become. The slogan of the German Communist Party when Hitler took power was "First Hitler, then us," which is probably like the worst slogan in the history of slogans. Why on earth did they have a slogan, "First Hitler, then us"? Because they thought that he would be an ineffectual right-wing prime minister, he would fail, and then they would ride his coattails into power. What this points to is that a lot of leftists, especially leftists in positions of leadership in the interwar European left, did not fully appreciate the threat that fascism and Nazism presented until, in some cases, it was too late. So when Hitler came to power, there was minimal in the way of resistance, and a lot of the left had to go into exile pretty quickly. The first real example where you can see this tide starting to shift from not taking them seriously enough to realizing the kind of existential threat that fascism posed can be found perhaps in 1934 in Austria, when the Austrian socialists rose up against a right-wing government, or in Asturias in northern Spain the same year when socialist miners staged an uprising against a right-wing government. But in a sort of broader sense, this is really all leading into the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 39, which at least early on was the epitome of pan-radical left unity in the face of the fascist threat. On the one side, you had the nationalist Francisco Franco, the army, the Catholic Church, supported by Hitler and Mussolini. The threat of fascism spreading across Europe was all too real. And on the other side, the Spanish left, the Spanish Republic, and leftists from around the world came to resist fascism. They were sometimes called premature fascists, which is shockingly a phrase that some people thought was useful, but nevertheless referred to the fact that this was the drama that led into World War II played out in advance. Here we can see an image of the Tom Mooney Company, which was part of the American Abraham Lincoln Battalion, which were Americans who journeyed to Spain to fight for the Republic, but there were groups from all around the world that came to fight fascism. Don't have time for a whole Spanish Civil War presentation. If you don't know about the war, it's very interesting. But in short, this anti-fascist unity faltered around the question of social revolution and class war. On the one hand, you had anarchists, Trotskyists, and others who argued for pursuing the social revolution in tandem with the war. On the other, you had communists affiliated with Moscow and some socialists who argued for essentially protecting bourgeois private property and pursuing the war. It's a lot more complicated than that, but those are the basic tendencies, came to blows, and ultimately this anti-fascist coalition fell apart. Before we go to the post-war period, let's quickly zip on over to Britain. So here we have some images from the Battle of Cable Street of 1936. What was the Battle of Cable Street, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. This was an instance where the anti-Semitic British Union of Fascists planned a march through the largely Jewish East End of London. Initially, interestingly enough, since we're trying to think through questions of left unity, the Communist Party of Great Britain argued against a counter-protest. They said, let the fascists march. Instead, they called upon their supporters to attend a demonstration in solidarity with the Spanish Republic, because this is the same time as the Spanish Civil War. The rank and file of the Communist Party was very upset, especially their Jewish members, and they pushed leadership to change course and participate in this counter-protest. When the day came, more than 100,000 anti-fascists, immigrants, unionists, residents of the East End of London showed up to block the march route of the fascists, who mobilized, I think, somewhere around 6,000 people to participate. Ultimately, the march didn't even happen. They couldn't even move. And the quote-unquote battle that ensued was really between the police and the anti-fascists. You can see the images. The slogan that the anti-fascists chanted at this demonstration was, "They shall not pass," which is, of course, the English version of "No pasarán," the slogan from the defense of Madrid in the Spanish Civil War. You can see it on the newspaper there. So this is seen as sort of one of the most iconic moments of Western European anti-fascist militancy and became inspirational for generations of anti-fascists through to the present day as an example of essentially community responses to the threat of fascism and a reluctance to allow fascists to intimidate communities at the very same time as the Nazi killing machine was not yet the final solution, of course, but was ramping up its persecution of Jews in Germany. So, in a moment we're going to get to the post-war situation, but I think in order to understand where post-war anti-fascists have been coming from, it's essential to see some of the kinds of lessons that they took from this history. So, quickly, what were a few of them? One, the need for left unity in the face of fascism. Leftists argue about just about everything, but maybe there's one place where they don't have to argue. Another is the notion that when fascism came to power in Italy and Germany, it came to power through largely legal means, through electoral methods, and then militant anti-fascists argue it's not sufficient to just hope that the government will hold up, that the police will hold up, if those have been actually the carpets upon which fascists have walked in the past. Related to that is the notion that these movements started out really small. When Hitler attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party before the name changed to the Nazi Party, at that time the party had 54 members. As I mentioned, Mussolini started out with 100. So post-war anti-fascists have argued we should treat every small Nazi or Klan group as if they could be Hitler's 54 or Mussolini's 100, even if most of them never will be. So these are some of the kind of frameworks that post-war anti-fascists have developed. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how they put them into practice. So sticking with Britain here for the time being, the story of fascism and anti-fascism in Britain is a little different from much of the continent because in the immediate post-war period, the British government afforded relatively a lot of space for the far right to regroup. So the very same fascists who were calling themselves fascists here, 10 years later, well, here we're not, this is more than 10 years later, but in the late 40s and 50s, were no longer always calling themselves fascists. They were calling themselves nationalists, patriots, and so forth. So right after the war, they started mobilizing again, targeting Jewish communities, and by the 50s, 60s, and 70s, shifting their focus towards targeting new immigrant communities that came to Britain from the Caribbean, South Asia, and elsewhere. So the National Front, for example, was one of the most influential fascist groups in Britain. They organized a Keep Britain White campaign with an anti-mugging march that they planned through an immigrant neighborhood called Lewisham in London. Right? So clearly coded racial language about crime as a way to capitalize upon xenophobic sentiment. The Battle of Lewisham was in some ways a kind of echo of the Battle of Cable Street, where immigrants from the neighborhood of Lewisham, anti-fascists, leftists, feminists showed up and again blocked the route of the National Front and really short-circuited their efforts to intimidate this community. The Battle of Lewisham led to the creation of the Anti-Nazi League, organized by the Socialist Workers' Party, which was instrumental in the Rock Against Racism concert series. So why were concerts such a big deal in this context? Well, in part because the fascists were trying to infiltrate punk and skinhead scenes. They catalyzed the creation of a neo-Nazi punk movement, because for those who don't know, skinhead was originally anti-racist, the product of a cultural exchange between Jamaican and British youth. They created this neo-Nazi variant, and they were trying to, in the context of economic devastation, capitalize upon young white resentment, which was channeled in this direction. So contestations emerged in Britain and really throughout a lot of the world, US and Canada, in punk spaces over whether this rebellion of punk was a rebellion against racism and white supremacy or for it. The slogan of Rock Against Racism became NF, the initials NF, which of course stood for National Front, but they said NF equals no fun. And in that way, they tried to reach young people who maybe weren't as interested in hearing political arguments, but wanted to feel part of a community through the aesthetic of music. And for those who are interested in the history of music, some historians of music have credited Rock Against Racism with being the first time that the white British population came into sustained contact with Jamaican music, something that subsequently is sort of taken for granted. But you'd have bands like Steel Pulse, X-Ray Specs, The Specials, The Clash playing in that way. And you see a sort of revival of an aspect of the three arrows of the early 30s, reimagined by the Anti-Nazi League as a single big arrow. This organizing led into the creation of Anti-Fascist Action in the mid-80s. Anti-Fascist Action's name is, of course, reminiscent to the German group of the early 30s. On one of their periodicals here on the left, you can see the phrase "no platform." No platform for fascism by the 70s in Britain became sort of one of the main slogans, which essentially is an argument for not allowing fascist and far-right groups to take even the first step towards normalizing their ideas in the public sphere. Rather than waiting for them to be so powerful that they pose a threat, try to nip it in the bud is essentially the framework. Also worth noting is that British anti-fascists did in this era a fair amount of IRA solidarity, in part because British fascism was in many ways integrally linked with like Ulster loyalism, so that specifically British politics were important there as well. So if we talk about post-war militant anti-fascism, two of the most important traditions to understand are the British tradition and then also the German tradition. So talk about that briefly. Here you have the street tactic known as the Black Bloc. For those who are unfamiliar with it, it's not a discrete organization, despite what Fox News would have you believe. It is a street tactic where people dress uniformly in black, cover their faces in the interest of not being identified. This tactic developed in the autonomous movement in Germany in the 80s, though it had interesting precedents in other kinds of times and places. Here is a Black Bloc anti-fascist demonstration in solidarity with an anti-fascist named Connie, who died when they were chased out in front of a car by the police. So it's important to understand the kind of resurgence of neo-Nazi and far-right politics that occurred in Germany in the late 80s and early 90s, especially exacerbated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the lead up to unification, when kind of an ultra-nationalism swept many people in the country, and immigrant communities from Turkey and elsewhere came under attack. I met, when I was doing these book presentations, I met a guy in Los Angeles who, his parents were refugees from Afghanistan, and he ended up living in, I forgot which German city, but somewhere in Germany in the late 80s, early 90s, and he talked about going to school as an Afghan kid and having the parents of the other kids instigate their kids to physically attack him. It was a dangerous time. Amnesty International issued a report condemning the inactivity of the German government in the face of this threat. An American Olympic bobsled member was assaulted by a neo-Nazi. And in this context, some of the most vociferous street opposition to the far right came from the German autonomous movement, sometimes in this militant street formation. So for example, I believe it was April 20th, 1989, the anniversary of Hitler's birthday, there was an attempt to organize a neo-Nazi demonstration in front of the Reichstag. These folks were the folks that showed up to try and make that a bit more difficult. Here we see a kind of reimagination of anti-fascist imagery. The image from the top right is from the 1930s when the flags were red, but by the late 80s, the black flag was often incorporated to signal the greater influence of anarchism and autonomous politics within German anti-fascism. Also important to note, this periodical we can see was published in Germany and Turkish because a fair number of these autonomous anti-fascists were Turkish migrants who were organizing for their self-defense during this era. Within a few years, the orientation had switched. Initially, left to right, flag became moving right to left. I'm not sure why, but it happened. Let's go over to North America for a little bit. So again, going back to something I said earlier on, if you want to think broadly about anti-fascism, broadly about resistance to white supremacy and imperialism, there's nothing new about anti-racist action in the late 80s. Certainly the Black Panthers spoke about anti-fascism. Certainly if you think more broadly, the peoples of the Americas are no strangers to this kind of issue. But if we want to trace the specific tendency of European-inspired militant anti-fascism to the United States, to Canada, we can start here with the creation of anti-racist action in the late 1980s. It really came about when there were some anti-racist skinheads in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis who were looking for a kind of model to resist the growing incursions of white power skinheads in their scene. And some of them were reading British punk zines, learning about, I should just use the clicker, that's why I have a clicker. Were learning about anti-fascist action, but decided that in the context of the United States in the late 80s, the language of anti-racism made more sense to them. It sounded less dogmatic or esoteric, and so was born Anti-Racist Action. This is their first newsletter from 1988. Here you can see sort of how they initially described their own kind of mission statement, but over the course of the coming decade, the network that grew out of this came to include hundreds of chapters across the US, Canada, and a little in Latin America, thousands of members. They went on tour with punk bands to promote their anti-racist youth politics. They went into high schools to talk to young people. They did abortion clinic escorts. And they really oriented their politics around four key notions. One, we go where they go. Wherever the far right was, they argued there should be some sort of opposition. Non-sectarian defense of all anti-fascists. Again, that notion of kind of left unity. Defense of reproductive rights. So they tried to come up with a sort of expansive notion of anti-fascism to respond to the Christian right. And we go where they go, non-sectarian, Christian right, and I'm having a Rick Perry moment. I can't remember the other one, it's in the book. Anyway, you get the idea of the politics. It'll probably come to me right when the presentation's over. So this is the trajectory that you get through to the anti-fascism of today. The Anti-Racist Action Network declined into the 2000s, and starting around 2007, you see a greater influence of European imagery and language in North American anti-fascism, evident in the first group to call themselves Antifa, which was Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon. Subsequently, over recent years, more groups have used this kind of originally German language to talk about their groups, but some groups still call themselves Anti-Racist Action. Now, before I wrap up and take questions, I'm going to say a few more things. First, there's a kind of one-dimensional notion of what this is all about in the media, I've noticed. When I speak to journalists about these kinds of politics, they're really obsessed with masks and confrontation and masks. There was an article in the New York Times, about anti-fascist fashion. A lot of articles came out about just simply the clothing. And so, fine. But I've encouraged journalists to also look into other ways that this politics can be played out. Groups that work within unions, community organizations, self-defense groups. Blue Ridge Autonomous Defense is a group in this area. I hope I got that name right. That you can check out, that comes out of this sort of community organizing perspective for popular self-defense, and that don't always necessarily include these kinds of tactical notions. So it is a broader politics, and that was certainly put into play for me when I spoke to an anti-fascist from Madrid named David, who talked about the development of anti-fascist neighborhood assemblies around Spain and also France. So how did those come about? Well, some of you may have heard of Occupy Wall Street, but maybe didn't know that there were earlier precedents elsewhere, like the 15M or 15M movement in Spain, which developed these popular neighborhood assemblies in the wake of the financial crisis. By 2014, 2015, as fascist groups in Spain like Hogar Social were trying to appeal to xenophobia, appeal to a far-right sentiment by, for example, giving out free food but only to ethnic Spaniards in the way that Golden Dawn did with ethnic Greeks and other groups have done. They started transitioning these popular neighborhood assemblies into popular anti-fascist neighborhood assemblies, where when Hogar Social tried to come into these communities, everyday unionists and community organizers and neighbors wouldn't put up with it. They just wouldn't allow them to go door to door demonizing immigrants. And so in that way, he argued that there are two faces to anti-fascism, and we must never forget either face, he argued. What are they? Number one, the first face is, from his perspective, that which tries to stop fascist and far-right groups from organizing. Don't let them disseminate their opinions. Don't let them normalize their politics. Don't let them take the first steps towards being a political force. That one's more self-evident, perhaps. The other face, as he saw it, was that which aims to essentially inoculate communities against the appeal of fascism. Make it so that when there's an economic downturn, people don't blame immigrants, they organize with their coworkers and with their neighbors. That makes it so that people who try to say, hey, you know what, maybe Hitler was right, that's not a perspective that we're going to tolerate. And in that sense, if you take a big picture perspective, if you look at stopping not just fascist groups, but the influence of their ideas on broader discourses and on politics, you start having to essentially step away from anti-fascism to talk about building a new world, trying to build a world where these kinds of ideas can't take the first step towards being influential, where anti-fascism is no longer a specialty activity, but is a self-evident mode of community existence. And so, in that sense, I think that the Italian slogan, Siamo tutti antifascisti, that we are all anti-fascists, is true, because ultimately you can think of it as a specific activity or as a broader way in our everyday lives, in our communities, of making it so that this will never happen again. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Now, don't be shy. Yes, go right ahead.
So there was a recent article in the Guardian, an op-ed, claiming that like anti-fascist action, Black Bloc, and Antifa, and all that has like led to the decline of the alt-right in the U.S. And that's been like the most prominent reason for its decline. Do you like agree with that, or do you think other more important factors are at play?
Good question. Well, as a historian, I've been trained not to give any monocausal explanations, so I won't start here. But nevertheless, I do think that... All right, so let's look at kind of recent history. So there have been interesting debates about anti-fascism that really revolve around two considerations. One is the kind of moral, ethical consideration of what is right or wrong to do politically, important to have. The other is the question of efficacy. What actually works? And here we're talking about the efficacy question. So I wrote an article in Salon about 1 year since the protests against Milo Yiannopoulos in Berkeley, trying to assess the arguments made by quite a few pundits and journalists back a year ago that by counter-protesting Milo Yiannopoulos, that would inevitably catapult him into fame. And so what I found is that actually that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, but one of them was popular mobilization, which drastically reduced his speaking dates. Prior to that, the previous year, he did, I forgot the exact numbers, they're in the article, but something like 50 presentations. After that protest over the next calendar year, he did about 10, including a few in Australia, and many of them were organized without giving the specific location publicly, which is, of course, from an organizer's perspective, a big defeat. His publisher dropped him. His lawyer that he had to sue the publisher dropped him. He tried to go back to Breitbart. Breitbart dropped him. He went to Daily Caller. For one day, he wrote one article. Daily Caller dropped him, and so forth. Natasha Leonard wrote an article in The Intercept about Richard Spencer, the known white nationalist, who recently called off his college speaking tour. He cited Antifa as the main reason, arguing that basically every time he wanted to have a presentation, things would become monumentally difficult. If you look at his recent talk in East Lansing, all sorts of organizers from all sorts of backgrounds showed up to block some of the fascists from entering his event. If you see the pictures, he had maybe a dozen sad-looking white dudes in the front row listening to him. And so basically, to me, it's not surprising, because any of you who have ever done activism know it's not easy to organize an event, to print flyers, to make sure people in your group show up, tell their friends to come, try and promote a political message. When you have a job, when you have a life, these things are challenging. But they become monumentally that much more difficult if there is a group of people putting all of their time into trying to stop you from doing all these things. And I think that these alt-right folks are finding that to be the case. After Charlottesville, which of course was promoted as the Unite the Right rally, obviously intended to unite the right, it didn't do it then, but still the numbers that they've gotten at subsequent events have been minuscule, even by comparison to that modest turnout. It's never too early to claim victory, but there is some evidence to suggest that trying to stop the alt-right from organizing stops them from organizing. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What was your opinion on like the approaches taken in Charlottesville by Antifa?
Sure. So basically, I assume you're referring to essentially trying to physically stop fascists from marching. Yeah, that seemed to work. I don't want to give a glib answer. So I met with some folks from different anti-fascist groups in Virginia who helped organize that event. And they walked me through what was a very interesting process of coalition building with local surge chapters, Black Lives Matter chapters, student groups, environmental groups, where they actually put a lot of thought and conversation into certain community accords around what would and would not be occurring that day. And so, for example, one of the interesting conversations was around whether or not to organize a black bloc. And interestingly enough, from what they told me, it was some of the liberal groups who were interested in organizing it, essentially from a white anti-racist perspective of wanting to put their bodies on the line at the forefront of stopping these groups, but ultimately as a group they decided not to for a variety of reasons. One, because the alt-right called out the black bloc to show up. They said, we want to fight the black bloc, and they didn't want to play into that. Two, because there's an anti-masking law in Virginia, and they were concerned about prosecution about that. And I think there was some other third interesting reason which I've forgotten. But the point being, you can follow up in a second, the point being that I think it's interesting to see how, on the one hand, the opposition to the far right in Charlottesville is probably, from a purely PR perspective, the best moment for militant anti-fascism within the last few decades in North America, in part because people came to see the horror of what was being put on display, and also it did, the event actually didn't happen. The Unite the Right rally actually didn't happen, and so in that sense, the kinds of criteria to assess efficacy of an anti-fascist or anti-racist action comes out good by my estimation, but please do follow up because I see you wanted to follow up.
Oh, I was just also wondering, like, if you think that the, like, since it was an unpeaceful protest, if you think there could have been, like, I don't know, if permits, like, could have been restricted for them, like, if you think
Oh, maybe, right? And so it had the alt-right not gotten a permit, that would have certainly derailed their plans. That's self-evident. But if you listen to Cornell, West, and other clergy who were there by their own account to participate in civil disobedience, they credited anti-fascists and anarchists with, from their account, saving their lives as they're being attacked by armed neo-Nazis. And so the question becomes, even if you intend to counter-protest the far right without resorting to self-defense, can you count on that always working? Charlottesville would be evidence to the contrary. Yes?
So do you think there's a possibility that, like one of the platforms that you said the anti-fascist uses to prevent them from being able to organize and getting that platform to speak,
Sure.
Do you think there's a danger of that crossing over into just not letting anyone with an opposing view speak, like people like conservatives such as Ben Shapiro?
Good question. So the slippery slope question, if I can summarize it neatly.
Slippery slope.
So, for folks who are interested in that issue, I will not so subtly direct your attention to my book. I have a section that gets into that, and so I'll only do a short version of that here. So I think there's a couple of issues. One is the proposition that we're discussing here of no platform for fascism is not actually a new proposition. It's one that militant anti-fascist groups have been attempting to put into practice in North America, Europe, and elsewhere for several decades. And so if there's a concern that by no platforming, fascists that will inevitably spiral into no platforming everyone one quote-unquote disagrees with, it seems to me that from an empirical perspective that would have happened quite a bit over the past few decades, and I don't know of it happening in an especially egregious way on a popular scale. In part because actually most anti-fascist organizing over the years has been not around individual speakers on campus, but around organized fascist and far-right groups, Klan groups, Nazi groups, and so forth. And so you can have an interesting discussion about the perspectives of a speaker. With these groups, it's a bit of a different kind of conversation. That having been said, a lot of the debate today in the US is about this issue. Who does or does not merit a platform? Richard Spencer, Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Charles Murray, and there's been a few other people in the news around that. I do think, though, that probably the number of people that we could come up with that have fallen into this conversation is probably no more than about a dozen, which does need to be borne in mind in the midst of the kind of fear that the far right has put forward that this is going to spiral into some sort of issue. But ultimately, I think it's a question about direct action. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think every time people organize a direct, I appreciate the snaps, I see you. Every time a social movement organizes a direct action, it raises the question of who has the quote-unquote right to impose themselves on the public sphere. So every time you deviate from the electoral playbook, that's a question. And that was evident for me with Occupy Wall Street. So occupied a park. So many right-wing journalists would say, what gives you all the right to occupy this park so no one else can use it? Right? How do you impose yourself on the public? And I think anytime you organize an unpermitted march, that you block the entrance to public transit to protest a police murder, and the question is always, what about commuters? What about people driving their cars? And so in that way, coming back to the conversation around speech, I think that if we understand politics not as something that's an analytically neat proposition, but as a messy question of public values colliding, and we look back on past social movements not as they've been remembered as these very neat, clean, good guy, bad guy propositions, but as messy questions of what are our goals, how will we get there, and when have we succeeded, the question becomes for me less who does or does not merit being no platformed, but more how do we as communities manifest our values in ways that are going to necessarily be messy and contested, but to me the alternative is to essentially cross our fingers and hope that the far right doesn't grow. To me, I don't see it as actually an empirically validated or a theoretically concerning issue. People will disagree. To me, the question is how can we build an anti-racist movement to make sure that more people don't get killed? That's more of a concern to me than questions of which far right figure are to be no platform. But that's just me. Do you want to follow up?
Just
please do.
I guess like what I was trying to say is just I feel like in America today, it's all if you like a lot of conservatives who critique Trump for some of his issues and they voted for him, it's kind of seen that if you voted for Trump and you will defend him on some of his issues, that you're automatically thrown into a fascist group. So if you want to, give your conservative views, that you're either going to be not allowed to, shut down, or there may be threats of violence.
Sure, I see what you're saying, but I think for the most part, if you look at the sort of recent carrying out of these kinds of actions, it's been usually pretty well, in my estimation, targeted around alt-right groups and far-right groups that create space for the alt-right, like Patriot Prayer in the Pacific Northwest is notorious for creating space for white supremacists to sort of organize, and the Jeremy Christian, the murderer in Oregon, was involved in that circle. It's always a question also of kind of contestations, how do politics get adjudicated? It's not easy, it's not clean, it's messy, but what I'm arguing is that anything that's meaningful politically will be. But a longer conversation to be had, read the book. Let's go right here in the middle. Yes?
How much of fascist ideals do you see as being fundamentally trying to create scapegoats for problems of capitalism, and where do you see anti-capitalism fitting into?
Yay! Thank you for asking that. That's a fun question. No offense. So I mean, now on the one hand, if you look at left analyses of fascism in the 20s and 30s, they reduced it to a question of capitalism to a degree that I think is one-dimensional, right? Scholars have pointed out how to really understand fascism, you also have to understand patriarchy, you also have to understand a number of different issues. That having been said, though, it is no coincidence that these fascist and far-right movements gain steam when people feel economic desperation, when they feel like they're being pitted against other people in their societies, when they look to immigrants as a scapegoat after the financial crisis of 2008, the Great Depression, economic issues in the 70s. No coincidence, and that's why militant anti-fascists argue for an explicitly anti-capitalist form of anti-fascism and see those things as related. And that's part of what distinguishes a militant anti-fascist tradition from some other factions that have resisted fascism in the interest of protecting a kind of capitalist republican government. Anti-fascists have a social revolutionary outlook, which is evident in their direct action methods and their anti-capitalism, so that the goal is not simply to stop the far right, but also to create a post-capitalist world where the far right couldn't grow, or at least would be much more difficult to grow. So, totally, 100%. You seem very concerned that I did not call on you, so I will go to you. And you're wearing a Yankees hat, so.
It's opening day.
Yeah, 6-1, 2 homers for Stanton, not bad. Go ahead.
Good day. So you mentioned part of the reason that the early anti-fascist group movements failed was because they failed to recognize the strength and opportunity that these socialist movements and fascism movements had. So do you feel like, you said that the book was a reaction to the 2016
Yeah.
election, so do you feel like we're on a right track, like we're recognizing a threat and moving to, you know,
Well, I mean, just to sort of start with what first comes into my mind, I was encouraged with a popular sign that was held at a lot of the protests against the Muslim ban, which was, first they came for the Muslims and we said, hell no, or whatever, the different kinds of things. So clearly, right, that's an effort to think through the ways that this can start out and escalate, and that people are interested in saying that we're not going to let that first step be taken. I think the fact that people don't take lightly a relatively fringe white supremacist giving a talk on a campus, that they recognize that if we don't stop it now, it could become a more mainstream position. I think these are all promising notions of trying to take a stand now rather than later when it's less difficult. That having been said, though, I think that there are still a lot of people out there who have what I call an all or nothing understanding of fascism. Either it is the government or don't worry about it. And of course, if it is the government, it's too late. It often starts small. And it's not just a question of will it become a regime, but looking at the violence that fascists and skinheads unleash on marginal communities all the time, it's no coincidence that a lot of the pundits who are dismissing this as irrelevant are not the kinds of people that are being targeted. And so the whole history that we're talking about, especially in the post-war period, a lot of it starts with people who don't have a choice about whether to be anti-fascist, organizing in their communities when the state or the police don't care or are hostile to them. And so that needs to be central. That is happening to some extent. I think it should be recognized more broadly. Yes?
Obviously, I feel like most people trying to push a fascist strategy aren't going to just come out marching the swastikas and everything. Like, you see that every once in a while. But in the case of some people, I imagine they try to push their rhetoric in a more subtle way. So are there any strategies or rhetorical tricks that we should be on the lookout for that fascists might use?
Sure. So the history of the post-war far right in Europe is those efforts at rebranding. So identitarianism is one of them. Trying to capitalize upon anti-colonial movements. Okay, if there could be national liberation in this country, why can't there be national liberation for white people or Europeans? If we can have an argument, sort of shifting away from explicit language around white supremacy towards white nationalism, the notion that all quote-unquote nations should have their own ethno-states, separate but divided. Even looking at, I mean, there was an article that came out recently about the interesting collaboration, even to some extent, between some factions within the Nation of Islam and the American Nazi Party, both arguing in the 60s about separate racial states. There are interesting ways that the far right has tried to capitalize upon new languages of race and identity to mobilize a kind of frustrated whiteness. I mean, the slogan, "It's okay to be white," that white supremacists have peddled recently is a way of totally misrepresenting the conversation and making it so that white people feel like there is an attempt to murder them all, which there is not. And so those are just a few examples that come to mind, but also the other thing is, if you have a more holistic intersectional understanding of politics, then I think it's useful to think in terms of spectrums of the fascistic, which can be evident in all sorts of kinds of politics, even if they're sometimes nominally left. And so Anti-fascism, I think, is a good place to start, but not a good place to end. I think you need a lot more than that, and understanding how different forms of patriarchy or transphobia or homophobia or ableism infiltrate into all sorts of kinds of politics is, to me, a necessary corollary on that. I'm going to take it from a different part of the room, because I've been doing a lot over here. Let's go all the way in the back. Yes?
I just wanted to throw out a couple of things.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you. I don't know, maybe if you stand up, I can hear you a little better.
I'll try. Is that better?
Yes.
I think there's a couple of things that just needs to be sort of added in.
Go for it.
First of all, like, not everyone is in a position where they can go out in the streets and take direct action to prevent something. And while that's understood, and there are no problems with that, it is important that support be provided for those who do catch felonies, especially as of late. There's more than 6 people charged with felonies from East Lansing. There's over 230 people from Disrupt J20 who are facing over 6 felonies apiece. And so jail support, jail solidarity, finding ways to support the people who are bold enough to take action is really, really important. And it's just as much part of the movement as anything else. And also that folks who are white and benefit from that privilege should be the ones on the front lines, not waiting, but inserting themselves as the barrier between those who could be harmed and those who wish to be.
Thank you for that. And also, about, what was it, about 160 of the J20 defendants were fortunately acquitted. There's, I think, maybe 59, 60 that are still awaiting trial, 59. The trials are coming up this next month, I believe, again. And so it is really frustrating in this era of hashtag resistance that the J20 defendants have been overlooked by much of the mainstream left. If you don't know about it, Google J20, Disrupt J20, and learn about it. And just want to echo that. Thank you for adding that. There are all sorts of ways to support resistance to the far right, anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing. No matter who you are, there's a way to do it. And in your everyday lives, making sure that we create strong communities that are resistant to it. Yes?
So, I have a question. Now, I noticed that at least in present day America with Trump and the recent movement of the alt-right, that a lot of it, there is a correlation between the alt-right and religious fundamentalism. Can you expand more on that?
Sure. There is an overlap to some extent. There are some far-right groups that have different kinds of constellations of religious or pseudo-religious views. But certainly, I mean, if you look at the history of the far right in the US, the question of religious, for lack of a better word, fundamentalism, Christian far right, can't be fully divorced from this, looking at the Klan, for example. Anti-racist action certainly focused in on that with their abortion clinic escort defenses in the 90s and subsequently. Beyond that, certainly I think that another way for thinking about multiple forms of resistance is also within religious communities and trying to think about what kinds of liberatory doctrines are available in all sorts of religious traditions to push back against those who are trying to use it for those kinds of ends. I'm sorry, I don't have a whole lot more off the top of my tongue for that, but yes, that is certainly part of the equation. So many hands. Let's go over here.
Hi. So I think there's this popular view, especially in the United States, that Antifa's actions are somewhat random, especially the more violent ones, you know.
Well, that is true of the radical left in general, as it is portrayed.
Yeah, it is portrayed as random, especially in the United States. And I think, or I should say, do you think that popular perception of the left kind of hinders its ability to be effective outside of the local level? So, like, in other words, do you think, as it is now, do you think the aesthetics, really, of the Antifa movement kind of hinder its efficacy?
Sure. So, in terms of the question of, like, being portrayed as random, I think to some extent radical politics will be portrayed like that in the foreseeable future. regardless of questions of quote-unquote violence and non-violence, regardless of the context, you name radical politics, it's going to be portrayed by the right and often by the center in that way. To me, radical movements can never count on the media to be their friends, for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the kind of corporate nature of media. There are powerful economic incentives to not portray these kinds of movements favorably on a consistent basis. There are always exceptions, of course. To me, the way that radical movements can get around that is through building connections through organizing. Because in my experience, people that I know who have trusted in media narratives around radical politics have most effectively had their minds changed when they've been at an event that was misreported, when they know someone who's involved in an event that was misreported, when they've been supported in their everyday life by groups who were misreported. And it's that kind of connection, I think, that you can build trust where people will see how Fox News or CNN report something and say, I know that's not true because I know these people, they do good work in my community, they're there to do fill in the blank. And in this case, help organize against the far right. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so as a follow-up, so I'm trying not to frame this as some sort of like pro-Leninist stance, but
that's your call.
But do you think it would be more effective if Antifa wasn't just like a platform, but there was an actual movement built from it, like an actual centralized movement built from it?
So we're talking about organizational form here.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are pros and cons of all kinds of organizational forms, which could be a whole topic of conversation unto itself. To some extent, I think that the questions of security enter into this quite a bit. There is a misnomer that a lot of these groups are disorganized or very loosely organized, but if you actually speak to folks who are involved in it, the level of commitment and time that's put into it, and often vetting of new members and the kinds of monitoring and surveillance of message boards in real life trainings that go on is quite time consuming and serious. If you think about a movement that is potentially subject to reprisals from the far right or state prosecution, certainly pyramid structures don't always survive too well in that. That's a kind of pro and con. Really though, to take a historical route, part of the explanation for why this is how it is comes out of anti-authoritarian politics of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, both in Europe and in North America. And that's why in the US and Canada, most anti-fascists have come from an anarchist and anti-authoritarian background. But if you're in favor of a more centrally organized anti-fascist formation, go do it. But yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to these different kinds of organizations. I'm going to just move on, just in the interest of time, but we can chat afterwards. No, good questions. Yes, in the corner.
Yeah, so you would agree that American politics as a whole is basically a pendulum of backlashes, right? So my question is, what happens when the left comes into power in 2020 or 24? What will the anti-fascism movement look like then in terms of like policy goals?
Sure. Well, I would not concede the term left to the Democratic Party. What the left is, can be debated, and that's an interesting question. But what you're pointing to that's really interesting is what will anti-fascist or anti-racist or left resistance look like when there is a Democrat in office? Because obviously a lot of what's going on now is resistance to groups and issues that existed prior to Trump when Obama was the president that will continue to exist when he is gone. And so part of the kind of radical dilemma is always to try and get liberals and moderates to care about the same things they care about when a Republican's in office, when a Democrat's in office. That is arguably one of the most pressing radical goals. And a lot of this has to do with concerns around Trump. This book would have gotten minimal interest if Hillary had won. In fact, it probably wouldn't have been written, but that's another story. So that is an important issue, and I think that the keys to doing it is by talking about larger structural issues around capitalism, around white supremacy that are much bigger than who's sitting in office. So yes, thank you for that. In the middle here, yes, in the white shirt.
Okay, so how does someone to a question was asked earlier about capitalism as kind of like going back to like the rally or the march in East London, then the confrontation between the police and the protesters, that they're kind of in confrontation with the state through the police in that the state is protecting the marchers. Do you see that also expanding into a kind of like anti-state format, which would be a kind of like anarchist position, obviously, for like specifically within contexts like G20 in Germany, like those kinds of like moments where even like sections of a city can kind of, they create zones of control with the kind of amount of force or the amount of participants that they have, as a kind of like resistance and a kind of emblem of like showing that people can still resist in some way even the state and its control?
Well, you know the answer to your question is yes, obviously. But yes, so certainly a lot of this politics, as we were just discussing, is essentially grows out of anarchist and anti-authoritarian premises about the relationship between fascism, capitalism, and the state. And part of the goal of Antifa direct actions is not only to stop the far right, but to essentially propose a form of counterpower as one of many forms of direct action, and to make an argument about the degree to which states are the problem as well, regardless of whether they're fascist. And so certainly these contingencies are connected. I was at the G20 protests in Hamburg over the summer, and I'm familiar with what you were talking about, and I would be confident that many of the people who were at that protest would agree with your characterization of these issues. So, yeah. In the back.
Could you expand on the ability of fascist and far-right movements to appropriate popular culture and media?
Yeah.
And what does that look like in the modern era of the internet and memes?
Sure. So, as we've been discussing, a lot of what fascist and far-right groups try to do is to win people over without necessarily explicitly making a kind of classical pop propaganda pitch. So some of that has been sort of infiltrating millennial kinds of humor, irony, sarcasm on the internet, of trying to bring people in, disaffected, especially young men who are interested in getting a rise out of snowflakes, but don't necessarily, quote unquote, believe what they're saying, but the more they say it, the more it becomes who they are, and so forth. Trolling, troll culture, right, exactly. Which a number of writers have written about. Also, you know, trying to, I mean, we've talked about music. There have been attempts to make fascist and far-right versions of just about every kind of music. Apparently in Germany there is such a thing as Nazi hip-hop, I kid you not. So obviously it seems to me that if you have a perspective that fascism attempts to legitimate itself in all sorts of spaces, both popular and subcultural, then what resistance looks like needs to also take all these different things into account. Then, you know, there's also the degrees to which issues around xenophobia, racism, and patriarchy pervade other, not necessarily as explicitly fascist forms of pop culture around, well, Gamergate certainly was very steeped in the alt-right and these kinds of things, but thinking about reactions to, you know, Ghostbusters, or to having protagonists of color or women in Star Wars movies, these arguments about who should and shouldn't represent different kinds of groups are very connected to all of this. I just want to check in with the organizers to see what they envision as far as time and how much more. We're doing good?
If you're comfortable with it, sure.
All right, well, if you leave, I won't take it personally. Yes, in the middle.
So I was curious as what you see allyship and Antifa looks like when it comes to predominantly like black and brown spaces.
Sure.
Like for instance, in Charlotte, North Carolina, there are like Antifa members there in support, but you have predominantly black and brown bodies who have a bigger police presence, and when that escalation point did come, they were the ones who were being arrested. And how the allyship looks like, because I do think that there are concern for problematic allies and their place in those spaces.
Good question. Yeah. Well, to go back to the example that I was told about in Charlottesville, that seemed to have been an effort for the various different groups that were involved in it to try and sort out how they coexist. Which is not to say that it was without issue. I'm sure there were issues. But it seems to me that organized groups, anti-fascist or otherwise, should, to the degree possible, be in touch with each other in advance about what actions will happen, who will be at risk for them, who will be supporting those who are arrested or prosecuted subsequently moving forward. Related to that is the question of sort of the demographic makeup of anti-fascist groups. And there is certainly a public perception that anti-fascist groups are predominantly white. I can neither confirm nor deny not having the data to support that, but there is certainly that perspective, and often perception becomes reality. So there is a question to be asked for white anti-racists and anti-fascists about how to relate to these struggles. And certainly I've heard arguments about being at the forefront of risk, but I think that that shouldn't necessarily be, or shouldn't at all be perceived as entitlement to do whatever you want to do. Certainly, when we think about anti-racism and resistance in the US, anti-fascism is but one small facet and not the most important facet. And in the context of Black Lives Matter and other struggles, I think it is incumbent upon anti-fascists, especially white anti-fascists, to think of how they situate within those contexts. So the issues you raise are ultra important. Yeah. Yes?
Kind of how you were mentioning about the development of a fascist government, even if they didn't start in power, it made me think of like how fascism isn't really a political ideology, but more of a cluster concept. And so the development of fascism isn't explicit. It doesn't happen all at once. It's more of a nascent growth where there's a few of the concepts under the umbrella term of fascism that rose in popularity or in concentration of what is being spoken about. And so from that, one of the concepts of fascism, of censorship and stuff, has kind of been nullified because of social media, because it's more of a direct communication between different types of people, and because historical perspective and circumstances changes political or social ideologies, how do you feel that other aspects of the fascist political agenda to be changed or altered, because the newest form of censorship is just making it seem completely illegitimate through saying it's fake news. And that's how they're dealing with censorship and social media.
Great, a lot there. It's too bad you weren't at the earlier conversation, because these were issues that we were talking about in interesting ways earlier. I am sympathetic to the notion that we may not be best served thinking of fascism as an ideology, at least if by ideology we mean a core set of beliefs that its adherents adhere to consistently. Because you look at the history of fascists, they will adopt and discard ideas perhaps more readily than any other political position, and they're not especially concerned about ideological coherence. They organize in response to that, against that. So I think that is an interesting way of looking at it, and certainly a lot of historians have tried to think of it in terms of related concepts. As far as the question of no platform and the internet, certainly the internet makes that a proposition more difficult, but in the wake of Charlottesville, for example, there was a lot of pressure on web servers to not host Stormfront and other Nazi websites. There's been pressure on social media platforms to not allow them. So there has been some success in essentially pushing these groups to farther and farther corners of the internet, which is not a solution, but I think is an improvement. But ultimately, there's only so much that can be done given the technology. And their recourse to fake news is not entirely new. There are precedents for that, but certainly is an issue in general. The irony, though, is I don't think the answer is to be a stalwart defender of everything the New York Times or CNN ever says. That to me is not the right way to respond, but rather to talk instead about what kinds of evidentiary reporting or writing we value and work through. Anyone who hasn't asked? All right. Well, I'll take you, and then if there's one more person who hasn't asked a question, I'll take them, and Okay, so let's go 1, 2, and I'll take both questions and then respond to both. So
I'll try to be quick because
yeah.
I want to follow up on it.
Yeah.
So I think you implied that there is a way that you can retard in either inviting people who are going to be incendiary on the alt-right, but I'm wondering how in an academic culture that's dedicated to academic freedom and First Amendment rights, you make those decisions, because to be transparent, we had that discussion about you.
Yeah, that's
understood. And trying to understand how is this going to be perceived outside the academic community. So do you have a framework? Do you have a set of questions? Do you have principles that can guide us?
Super. Let me take the other question and then I'll respond to both.
Mine was in terms of immigration and how colorism and Antifa communities kind of tends to come around. So essentially, the question of immigration in itself would be, how would Antifa be able to help communities of color, especially immigrants, in abolishing systems like ICE, which is police state violence against a group of people, while typically in itself, I can only talk from my perspective, having people, having friends, having family who are constantly in danger of deportation, and in itself, just how do we, because from my perspective, Antifa comes with a level of privilege, as you mentioned before. It's kind of like, you mentioned that there's no real data to say that it's predominantly white, but still in mainstream media and in other places, you do see it as predominantly white. So the people that stand to gain more from Antifa and the ideals and abolishing state violence tend to be the people that are demonized and targeted, like activists, immigration activists that are literally being targeted by ICE because of what they believe. So how do you address these colorism and racist issues within these communities?
Great, thank you. I'm going to start here and then I'll come back over here. So, right, those are super important issues, and I think it's important to understand that militant anti-fascism is one specific facet of one response to one specific issue. It's not a politics that can be applied to all sorts of social issues. What it looks like to build a popular movement against ICE and in support of immigrants and undocumented people and refugees is much broader and must entail a broader array of methods and forms of organizing than simply militant anti-fascism. The question of sort of privilege in anti-fascism, certainly there are folks that are part of groups who do this kind of work because they think it's the right thing to do and aren't necessarily of the identities that are most at risk. But there I've met plenty of people who are among some of these marginalized identities who are being targeted by the far right. So just want to, there's a range. But for example, in Europe, the connection is often very explicit. I spoke to some anti-fascists from Thessaloniki in Greece who run a social center, and their local anti-fascist organizing runs out of the social center, and they have housed refugees from Syria and Iraq who have started to participate in their anti-fascist kickboxing club. And there are some Syrian bakers who have opened up a bakery in the social center, and the anti-fascists help them sell their baked goods through networks of solidarity economics. Similarly in, what was it? It wasn't Amsterdam, it was one of the other Dutch cities. I heard some stories about essentially reaching out to refugees who did not have a place to stay, setting them up in squatted apartments, and then essentially building bridges so that they would often go out to confront the far right together. These are anecdotal, but I think they do point to the ways in which different forms of organizing should be seen as related, and we should be looking for ways to support the undocumented refugees. And I think really the answer is to think about broader forms of popular community self-defense and broader ways of understanding that, rapid response networks, who has the ability to sit down in front of an ICE van, those who don't, other ways to support pressuring cities not to allow this to happen. It's a bigger issue, it's super important. What I'm talking about is sort of one part of resistance to white supremacy and state violence, but you can't stop there. This is like a small piece of the larger puzzle that you're referring to. Questions of how to adjudicate questions of speech on campuses. Again, I have a section in the book where I lay this out in more detail. To me, to try to cut to the issue as succinctly as possible, it's partly a question of, are universities spaces that have values or not? On just about every issue, the response from administration and faculty is a unanimous yes. We are in favor of diversity. We are in favor of multiculturalism. Look at our students who've come in from other countries. Look at our LGBTQ centers, our Africana houses, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on and on. When it comes to this issue, all of a sudden, administrations argue that they are entirely neutral, have no values, and will allow anything to happen on campus. Can you have it both ways? Well, even in terms of Title IX laws about what cannot be said in classrooms, there are certain things that students could say in classrooms and be kicked out of the class without anyone batting an eye. Those are value-oriented assessments. So to me, it's partly a question of, as students, as faculty, as communities, do we try to invest our universities with minimalist, anti-racist, feminist notions? Minimalist. I'm not talking necessarily that it has to expand into a coherent ideological position, but to me, not allowing people to promote genocide, to promote the dehumanization of our peers on campus actually promotes legitimate space where people who are targeted and marginalized feel like they can adequately participate in the public conversation. Ulrich Bayer, the vice provost of NYU, wrote an article in the New York Times, What Snowflakes Get Right About Free Speech, where he wrote, very much informed by a continental European position on this issue, that if we allow groups on campus to make it so that essentially only conservative white men feel comfortable voicing their opinions, that is not in the interest of a meaningful free speech. Does that have the potential for groups trying to push to ban people like myself? Sure. But to me, the question is not, should we try to have values as a community, but rather, as committed anti-racist, anti-fascist feminists, we should push to have those kinds of values in a very minimalist sense be put forward. And ultimately, I think to some extent, it's indicative of the kinds of debates that classical liberals and different kinds of socialists have been having for 200 years. When we think of rights, do we abstract them and think of them in terms of removed from the economic social circumstances? And in that sense, a sort of abstract classical liberal notion of free speech would be anyone say and do anything they want whenever they want? Or do we necessarily insist on embedding those rights frameworks within lived material reality and think through what it means to have a white supremacist organization mobilizing on campus, what that actually means? Not what it means hypothetically or analytically, but what it actually means. And to me, if you're actually committed to these values, you have to think through them in that context. Moreover, really, a lot of the kinds of issues that we're talking about really only affect, as we're talking about, the most extreme manifestations of this. Is there a question of where do you draw the line? Of course, because that's what politics is about. Politics is always about questions of drawing lines, demarcating values. It's a process that is old, will continue, and I think it ought to be understood in the context of struggle, not in the context of a kind of stagnant, abstract perspective. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking about an upcoming event. We have books for sale.
I can write my name in it.
Yeah.
So
I want to thank all of you, of course, on behalf of the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Peace Studies for coming out tonight. I also want to take this opportunity to invite you to an upcoming commemoration of other victims of German fascism and, of course, their various allies. I'm, of course, referring to European Jews and the upcoming event of Yom HaShoah here on campus on April 12th. We're going to be doing that, a reading of the names of the murdered here on campus, if the weather is bad in the library, if the weather is okay outside the library. We're going to be starting those events on April 11th in a joint lecture by a colleague of ours from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and also, in fact, a joint event with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This is a lecture on April 11th at 7 p.m. in the Blue Ridge Ballroom, i.e. PSU, second floor, 7 p.m. free of charge. You're all invited. Thank you again for coming, and thanks to our speaker.